The cold didn't just bite, it excavated. I stood on the corner of Charles Street, the nor'easter howling through the canyons of Beacon Hill like a wounded predator. My lungs felt like they were being lined with crushed glass with every breath. At 32 years old, I was supposed to be at the peak of my career as the lead architect for Sterling and Cross's most ambitious algorithm. Instead, I was a human courier, my fingers vibrating with a fever that had spiked to 103 degrees an hour ago. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a sharp, insistent vibration that felt like a localized seizure against my hip. I didn't need to look at the ID. Only one person demanded this level of masochism. "Elena, tell me you're close," Julian's voice crackled through the Bluetooth earpiece, smooth as a 30-year-old scotch and just as intoxicating. There was no hello, no how are you feeling. Only the transaction. The board is breathing down my neck about the burn rate on the Chimera project. If I don't have those encryption keys for the 8 a.m. pitch, we aren't just looking at a down round. We're looking at a funeral. "I'm 2 blocks away, Julian," I said. My voice sounded like it belonged to a stranger, thin and frayed. I tripped over a hidden curb, my knees hitting the icy pavement with a dull, sickening thud. I didn't feel the pain, only the sudden, terrifying heat of my own blood seeping through my stockings. The fever, it's getting harder to see the street signs. Focus, Elena. Think about the fiduciary duty we owe to our investors. Think about what we've built, he said, his tone shifting into that practiced, charismatic hum that had kept me in his orbit for 3 years. Once this goes through, you aren't just an architect. You're an owner. Now, get to the apartment. I've got a bottle of Krug on ice. He hung up. The silence that followed was heavier than the snow. I forced myself up. My hand, encased in a thin, wet leather glove, gripped the cold steel of the USB drive inside my pocket. It weighed less than an ounce, yet it felt like a lead anchor dragging me toward the bottom of the Atlantic. I pushed through the whiteout, my vision tunneling until the world was nothing but gray shadows and the rhythmic, frantic beat of my own heart. When I finally reached the wrought iron gates of his brownstone, a black Audi A8 sat idling at the curb. Its exhaust plumed in the frozen air like phantom breath. I approached the passenger side, expecting the door to fly open, expecting Julian to rush out, wrap his cashmere coat around my shivering frame, and tell me I was insane for coming out in this. Instead, the window hummed as it lowered, a slow, mechanical grind that sounded like a guillotine being readied. The warmth from the interior hit my face, a cruel mockery of the hell I had just walked through. The scent of Julian's Tom Ford oud would drifted out, thick and expensive. I saw him then. He was dressed in a charcoal turtleneck, his hair perfectly coiffed, not a single hair out of place. He wasn't alone. In the passenger seat sat Sienna Brooks. Her blonde hair was a polished gold halo under the Audi's ambient LED lighting. She was wrapped in a vintage mink coat that cost more than my annual salary, her lips curved into a tiny, feline smile as she looked at her phone. Julian didn't look at my face. He didn't see the sweat frozen into beads on my forehead or the way my chest rattled with every shallow gasp. His eyes went straight to my hand. "Give it here, Elena." "I'm freezing, and we're already late for dinner," he growled. I stood there, paralyzed. My gloved fingers were fused to the metal of the drive. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time, the blindfold of devotion didn't just slip, it disintegrated. He wasn't a titan. He was a thief in a tailored suit. "Julian," I whispered, the word catching on the phlegm in my throat. I think I need a hospital." Sienna didn't look up from her screen, but her voice drifted out, sharp and melodic. "Julian, honey, we're going to lose our reservation at Oya. You know how they are about the Omake start times." Julian's jaw tightened. He reached out, his fingers brushing against my frozen skin as he snatched the drive from my hand. He didn't offer a hand to steady me. He didn't even say thank you. "Take an Uber, Elena. Charge it to the office," he said, his eyes already shifting to the dashboard display as he plugged the drive in. "Great work tonight. See you at the top." The window hummed back up, sealing the warmth and the light away from me. The Audi shifted into gear. As it pulled away, the rear tires hit a slush-filled pothole. A wave of icy, gray filth erupted, drenching me from my waist to my boots. I didn't scream. I didn't even move. I stood in the dark, the snow beginning to bury my feet, watching the red glow of his taillights vanish into the white void. The last thing I remember before the world turned black was the sound of my own laughter, a dry, hacking sound that was indistinguishable from a death rattle. Beep. 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 The sound was clinical, rhythmic, and utterly heartless. I opened my eyes to a ceiling of white acoustic tiles. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and industrial-grade bleach. A plastic tube was snaked down my throat, a cold, invading presence that breathed for me. Every time the ventilator pushed air into my lungs, it felt like a bellows expanding against raw meat. A hand gripped mine. It was rough, calloused, and trembling. Elena? Oh God, Elena, don't move. I turned my head with a tectonic effort. Marcus sat in a plastic chair, his face a map of exhaustion and fury. He looked 10 years older than the last time I'd seen him. How long? I tried to say, but it came out as a wet gurgle against the tube. 3 days, Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. Severe pneumonia. Sepsis. Your kidneys nearly quit on us, Elle. The doctors said, they said to prepare for the worst. I closed my eyes. The image of the Audi's window rolling up played on the back of my eyelids like a cursed film loop. Julian, I thought. The name didn't bring a pang of longing. It felt like a piece of shrapnel I needed to excise. He didn't call, Elena, Marcus said, reading my silence with the intuition of a brother who had spent years watching me destroy myself for a ghost. I called the office. His assistant told me he was in the Hamptons celebrating the Chimera launch. She said he didn't want to be disturbed by personnel issues. A clinical detachment settled in my chest, precise and freezing. The heat of the fever was gone, replaced by a permanent, sub-zero resolve. My pulse, displayed on the monitor beside me, remained perfectly flat. I looked at Marcus and signaled for a pen. My hand shook, the Mont Blanc pen, Julian's gift to me on our first anniversary, feeling like a 1,000-pound weight. I didn't write a plea. I didn't write an "I love you." On the back of my discharge paperwork, I scrawled 3 words in jagged, ugly strokes. Liquidate everything. Now. As the ventilator hissed, I realized Julian Sterling had made a fatal calculation. He believed he had stolen the keys to the kingdom. What he didn't know was that I had built a backdoor into the very foundation of his empire. In 72 hours, the Chimera wouldn't just be his greatest success, it would be the SEC's primary evidence for a $500 million securities fraud. Julian thought he left a broken woman in the snow. He didn't. He left a ghost. And ghosts don't have fiduciary duties. They only have debts to collect. The hospital gown was a paper-thin insult to my dignity. I pulled the adhesive EKG pads from my chest, the sharp sting of the tape tearing at the fine hairs of my skin a necessary jolt to my nervous system. Marcus watched from the corner of the room, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. He didn't try to stop me. He knew that when I looked like this, my eyes wide and unblinking, my movements precise as a Swiss watch, the Elena, who played by the rules was gone. The doctor said you need a week of 4 antibiotics, Elle, Marcus said, his voice low. He held out a bag of my clothes, salvaged from my apartment. I don't have a week, I replied. I reached for the 4 line in the back of my hand. The plastic catheter was a foreign invader under my skin. I gripped the hub, took a sharp, shallow breath, and slid it out. A bead of dark, venous blood bloomed on my skin. I pressed a cotton ball over it, not waiting for the bleeding to stop before I began to dress. I have exactly 48 hours before Julian's Chapter 11 restructure team begins the audit on the Chimera project. If my name is still on those filings when the SEC hits, I don't just lose my career. I lose my freedom. I pulled on my black turtleneck. The fabric felt like armor. "What do you need?" Marcus asked. He was already opening his encrypted laptop, the blue light reflecting in his glasses. This was our language, not comfort, but coordination. A bypass for a MacBook Pro, M3 chip. And a high-speed clone of a local drive, I said, sliding my feet into my loafers. My legs felt like they were made of damp cardboard, but my mind was a high-resolution map of Julian's sins. "I'm going back to the apartment. Sienna will be at her Pilates and Prosecco brunch. I need to get into her files." The Upper East Side apartment smelled of Sandal 33 and unearned luxury. It was a 3-bedroom penthouse Julian had helped us lease, a gold-plated cage where I did the work and Sienna Brooks did the social climbing. I walked across the white marble foyer, the silence of the space echoing the hollowness of the last 2 years. Every piece of furniture, every $200 candle, had been paid for by my bonuses Julian had told me were investments in our future. I walked straight to Sienna's bedroom. It was a chaotic altar to vanity, discarded silk dresses, open boxes of Cartier jewelry, and her MacBook Pro sitting carelessly on a velvet duvet. My hands were steady as I plugged in Marcus's black box. A progress bar appeared on my own tablet, a thin green line crawling across the screen. I wasn't just looking for photos of her and Julian. I was looking for the shell company. Julian was smart, but he was arrogant. He believed I was too blinded by US to notice the discrepancy in the vendor payments. Click. The bypass cleared. I scrolled through the hidden directories, my eyes scanning the digital clutter until I hit a folder labeled J&C Logistics. Jenkins & Co., I whispered. Sienna's maiden name was Jenkins. I opened the ledger. It was a masterclass in wire fraud. Over the last 24 months, Julian had approved 6-figure payments for international marketing consultation to this shell entity. The services were non-existent. The money, however, was very real. It had been funneled through a series of offshore accounts before landing in a joint credit line Sienna used to fund her influencer lifestyle. Julian hadn't just cheated on me. He had used my algorithm's R&D budget to pay for the mink coat she was wearing while I froze in the snow. A clinical coldness settled in my marrow. I initiated the high-speed clone. The drive hummed, a low-frequency vibration that traveled up my arm and settled in my teeth. 15%. 45%. 80%. The front door clicked. The sound of Sienna's laughter drifted down the hall, melodic and false. "He's just so dramatic, Julian." I told him the Hamptons house needs the infinity pool finished by July. Julian's voice followed, a low, possessive rumble. "Whatever you want, babe. The Chimera launch is going to make the IPO look like pocket change." I didn't panic. Panic was for victims. I watched the progress bar hit 100%. I snatched the black box and my tablet, sliding them into my oversized tote just as the bedroom door swung open. Sienna stood there, her blonde hair perfectly tousled, wearing a red silk slip dress that looked like a smear of fresh blood against the white walls. Julian was right behind her, his hand on her waist. They both froze. Julian's eyes went from my face to the laptop on the bed, his expression shifting from shock to a dangerous, narrow-eyed suspicion. "Elena," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave. "You should be in the hospital. You look frail." "I've never felt sharper, Julian," I said. I walked toward them, my heels clicking with a lethal rhythm on the hardwood. I didn't stop until I was inches from his chest. The scent of his oud wood was suffocating. "I came to get my grandmother's pearls. And to tell you I've sent my resignation to HR, effective 5 minutes ago." Sienna let out a sharp, breathless laugh. "Resigning? Elena, you're the lead architect. The project will fail without you. You're being selfish." I looked at her, really looked at the woman I had called my best friend for a decade. "The project is already dead, Sienna. You just haven't smelled the rot yet." I turned to Julian. He was staring at me, his fingers twitching. He was calculating his fiduciary duty to his board versus the threat I represented. He didn't know I had the clone. He thought I was just a woman with a broken heart. "You're making a mistake, Elena," Julian warned. "If you walk out now, you forfeit your equity. You'll have nothing." "I've had nothing for 2 years, Julian," I said, my voice flat and final. I just didn't realize it until the snow hit my face. I walked past them. In the kitchen, I stopped at the marble island. I pulled the printed stack of Jenkins & Co. fraud invoices from my bag and laid them out next to Sienna's $400 jade face roller. It was a silent indictment, more powerful than any scream. I walked to the front door. My keys felt heavy in my hand, the keys to a life that had been a carefully curated lie. I looked back one last time. Julian was standing by the island, his face draining of color as he looked at the top invoice. Sienna was reaching for him, oblivious to the fact that her world had just caught fire. I stepped out into the hallway and approached the building's trash chute. I held the keys over the dark, metallic opening. For a heartbeat, I felt the phantom weight of the years I'd wasted. Then, I opened my hand. The keys hit the metal sides of the chute with a series of sharp, diminishing clangs before vanishing into the dark. I took the service elevator down. Marcus was waiting in the black SUV at the curb, the engine idling. I got in, closed the door, and looked at the done notification on my tablet. "Where to?" Marcus asked. "Logan Airport," I said, leaning my head back against the leather. "Julian thinks he owns the game because he has the board. He's about to find out what happens when the architect burns the blueprints." As we pulled away from the curb, my phone buzzed. A text from Julian: "We can fix this, Elena. Come back to the apartment. Let's talk." I didn't reply. I opened the settings, tapped deactivate SIM, and dropped the card into my cold dregs of coffee. By the time I landed in Austin, Elena Vance would be a ghost. And in the high-stakes world of Manhattan finance, there is nothing more dangerous than a ghost who knows where the bodies are buried. Austin in July was a physical assault. The humidity didn't just hang in the air, it had mass, a heavy, wet blanket that smelled of asphalt and scorched cedar. I stood outside the Caldwell and Forge headquarters, a jagged monolith of black glass and brushed steel, and felt the sweat begin to prickle at the base of my neck. I adjusted the lapel of my tailored ivory blazer. 18 months of living as a ghost in a sun-drenched studio apartment over a bakery had scrubbed the Manhattan burnout from my skin. I had spent 500 days rebuilding my algorithms from the floor up, working in the dark, my only company the rhythmic hum of a liquid-cooled server and the jagged line of Julian Sterling stock price on my secondary monitor. I wasn't here to interview. I was here to offer a sacrifice. The air conditioning inside the lobby hit me like a clinical slap, a dry, sub-zero chill that felt like home. I checked in with the security desk, a slab of white quartz that looked expensive enough to fund a mid-sized startup. "Elena Vance to see Mr. Cross," I said. My voice was a flat, horizontal line, devoid of the desperate tremors that had once defined my interactions with Julian. "The 50th floor is expecting you, Ms. Vance," the receptionist replied, her gaze lingering on the sharp, surgical bob of my hair. The elevator didn't just move, it surged. I watched the floor numbers climb, the pressure in my ears a familiar companion. In Manhattan, I was a supportive partner. In Austin, I was a quantitative architect who saw the world in high-frequency trading patterns and mathematical rot. The 50th floor opened into an office that looked like it had been carved out of a single block of ancient oak. Gideon Cross sat behind a desk the size of a pool table. He didn't look like the polished, manicured sharks of Wall Street. He had the shoulders of a linebacker and eyes the color of a winter sea, gray, cold, and utterly lacking in empathy. He didn't stand up. He just looked at the 3 pages of my resume sitting on his desk. "Your resume is thin, Elena," Gideon said. His voice was a low, Texan rumble that felt like it was vibrating in the floorboards. 3 years at Sterling and Cross. Junior title. Then a total blackout for 18 months. In my world, a gap like that usually means rehab or a non-compete that someone was too stupid to fight. A clinical detachment settled in my chest. I didn't sit down. I walked to the edge of his desk. My resume is a fiction, Mr. Cross, I said, my pulse remaining perfectly flat as I locked eyes with him. The titles on that paper were designed to keep me invisible while Julian Sterling used my brain to build his empire. I am the architect behind the Chimera project. Every beta-adjusted gain they've seen in the last 3 years was a result of my code. Gideon leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking with a sound like a ship's hull under pressure. Then why is Sterling and Cross currently hemorrhaging 15% of its market capitalization? If you're the architect, why is the building on fire? Because I didn't just build the engine, I replied. I built the expiration date. Julian Sterling is a salesman who thinks he's a genius. He doesn't understand the arbitrage logic that sustains the project. Without me to calibrate the risk parameters, the algorithm is eating itself from the inside out. I reached into my bag and pulled out a leather-bound folder, the dossier Marcus and I had spent months perfecting. This was the micro moment. I didn't just hand it to him. I placed it on the edge of the oak desk. I felt the weight of the document, exactly 1.2 pounds of high-grade parchment and ink. I extended my index finger and pushed. The folder slid across the polished surface with a low, agonizingly slow hiss, the sound of silk on stone. It traveled 18 inches, crossing the digital divide between his power and my survival, until it stopped exactly 2 inches from his left hand. Gideon looked at the folder, then back at me. He opened it. The room went silent, save for the hum of the HVAC. I watched his eyes move, not scanning, but dissecting. He was looking at the structural weaknesses I had highlighted in Sterling and Cross's debt-to-equity ratio. He was looking at the hostile takeover roadmap I had drafted. You're proposing we gut them, Gideon said, his eyes flicking to a graph showing the projected collapse of Julian's holding company. I'm proposing we liquidate them, I corrected. I want you to use Caldwell and Forge's capital to buy their debt for pennies on the dollar. I want you to trigger the default clauses I wrote into their B-round financing. I want you to take everything he owns, the company, the Hamptons estate, the reputation, and I want you to do it with my hands on the lever. Gideon reached for a crystal decanter on his side table. The glass stopper came out with a sharp, resonant pop. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a heavy glass. The scent of vanilla and charred oak filled the space between us. You're cold, Elena, Gideon noted, swirling the bourbon. Most quants just want a bonus and a corner office. You want a bloodbath. I spent 3 years being a supportive partner to a man who left me to die in a blizzard, I said, my voice dropping to a surgical whisper. I've done the math, Mr. Cross. Revenge has a 100% ROI if you have the right patron. Gideon stared at me for a long, unblinking minute. I didn't fidget. I didn't breathe. I stood like a statue, my hands folded at my waist. Finally, Gideon slid a second glass toward me. Monday. 8 a.m., he said. The gray eyes finally sharpened into something predatory, recognition. You failed to meet my projections, and I will personally ensure you never work in finance again. You succeed, and you get the partnership you asked for. And Julian Sterling gets the funeral he deserves. I took the glass. The crystal was cold, heavy, and solid. I took a sip, the bourbon burning pleasantly as it went down, a sharp contrast to the antiseptic taste of the hospital I had left 18 months ago. He won't just have a funeral, Mr. Cross, I said, setting the glass down with a precise, final click. I'm going to make sure he's the one who pays for the flowers. As I walked out of the black glass monolith and back into the sweltering Austin heat, my phone buzzed with an automated alert I'd set years ago. Sterling and Cross had just filed for a temporary stay on their debt obligations. Julian was drowning. He didn't know I was the one holding the anchor. He didn't know that on Monday, his greatest nightmare wasn't going to be the SEC. It was going to be a woman in an ivory blazer who knew exactly where the foundation was cracked. The war room at Caldwell and Forge was a masterpiece of clinical aggression. It was a circular chamber on the 51st floor, windowless and lined with floor-to-ceiling OLED screens that pulsed with the blue and green heartbeat of the global markets. The air was kept at a constant 64 degrees to protect the server racks humming behind the soundproofed walls, creating a perpetual, sterile winter. I stood at the center of the room, my hands resting on the edge of the glass command console. Gideon Cross sat in the shadows of the periphery, a silent, predatory observer. Julian's liquidity is a ghost story, I said. My voice was a flat, horizontal line, cutting through the low-frequency hum of the room. I tapped the console. A jagged, crimson line erupted across the main screen. The strategy was simple. We would drive the price down, trigger the margin calls, and then step in as the savior to buy the debt. Once we held the debt, we would strip the company of its only real value, the Chimera Code, and sell the physical remains for parts. I watched the sell orders begin to populate the queue. They were small at first, like the first few drops of a storm. But they were relentless. I've spent 3 years being the woman who made him look like a genius, I whispered, the red light of the screen painting my face in a mask of crimson. Now, I'm going to be the woman who shows the world he's a ghost. I reached for the crystal water glass sitting on the console. My hand was as steady as a surgeon's. I took a sip of the ice-cold water, feeling it slide down my throat, a sharp, refreshing contrast to the sweltering heat of my own ambition. Gideon looked at me, a slow, predatory smile finally touching his lips. I like your math, Elena, he said. He picked up his own stylus and signed the authorization for the $10 billion short position. The digital signature flickered in gold, the mark of the executioner. Tomorrow, Manhattan wakes up to a bloodbath. Make sure you're wearing something he'll remember. I'm wearing his funeral, Gideon, I said. I walked to the door of the war room. Before leaving, I looked back at the screens one last time. The red line I had drawn was now a plunging cliff. In 12 hours, Julian Sterling would be standing at the edge of it. He would look for me to catch him. He would look for the woman who always solved his problems. He would find a liquidator instead. As the elevator descended to the lobby, my personal phone, the one with the deactivated SIM, buzzed with a notification from a private investigator I'd hired in New York. Julian Sterling has just been seen leaving Oya with Sienna Brooks. He looks celebratory. He just bought a 2021 Porsche 911. I deleted the message. Let him celebrate. Let him buy the car. It's easier to take everything from a man when he thinks he's at the top of the world. By 10 a.m. tomorrow, the only thing Julian Sterling will own is the debt on a car he can no longer afford to park. The private jet sat on the tarmac at Austin Executive, its white and silver fuselage shimmering under the oppressive Texas sun like a polished bone. Gideon Cross stood by the boarding stairs, his hands in the pockets of his charcoal suit trousers, watching me approach. I wasn't the woman who had fled this city 18 months ago with a fever and a broken heart. I was a market capitalization predator. I had spent the last 72 hours orchestrating a multi-billion-dollar margin call that would act as a noose around Julian Sterling's neck. The markets opened 5 minutes ago, Gideon said, his gray eyes scanning my face for a flicker of hesitation. The short selling position we took yesterday has already triggered a 12% drop in Sterling and Cross. The rumors are hitting the Bloomberg terminals now. They're calling it a unexplained technical failure in the Chimera algorithm. It's not unexplained, I said, my voice as cold and level as the horizon. It's a deliberate structural collapse. I wrote the code to fail if the due diligence benchmarks weren't met manually every quarter. Julian was too lazy to check the logs. He thought the money would just keep coming. I stepped into the cabin of the Gulfstream. The interior was a sanctuary of cream leather and polished walnut, smelling of expensive stationery and the faint, ozone scent of high-altitude air. I didn't sit down immediately. I walked to the small dressing area at the rear of the plane. Hanging on the hook was the garment bag Marcus had delivered this morning. I unzipped it with a slow, deliberate motion, the metallic zip of the fastener echoing in the quiet cabin. Inside was a Saint Laurent power suit in midnight blue, the color of a deep-sea trench. I reached out and touched the fabric. The wool-silk blend was cool, substantial, and possessed a razor-sharp grain. I ran my thumb over the shoulder padding, feeling the rigid structure that would hold me upright when I faced the ghosts of my past. Then, there were the shoes. I pulled them from the dust bags. They were black Saint Laurent pumps with a 4-inch stiletto heel that ended in a point sharp enough to draw blood. I held one up, feeling the weight, exactly 340 grams of Italian leather and lethal intent. I slid my foot into the first shoe. The fit was surgical, the arch supporting my foot with a terrifying precision. I stood up, the heel striking the cabin floor with a sharp, resonant crack that signaled the end of my exile. I checked my reflection in the mirror. My face was a mask of clinical detachment. The Elena, who had paid for Julian's Tissot watch and cried over his coldness, was gone. In her place was the architect of his ruin. I walked back to the main cabin and sat across from Gideon. He was already reviewing the M&A, mergers and acquisitions, strategy on a secure tablet. Julian is scrambling, Gideon noted, tapping a data point. He's trying to secure a capital infusion from a private equity group in Qatar. If he gets that cash, he can cover the margin and stabilize the stock. He won't get it, I replied. I leaned back, my pulse remaining perfectly flat. I've already contacted the lead partner at that firm. I've shared the audit I performed on Julian's shell companies. Once they see the evidence of embezzlement and the fraudulent vendor payments to Sienna Brooks, they'll drop him like a contagion. In Manhattan, nobody wants to be the last person holding a burning building. The plane began to taxi, the powerful engines humming with a low-frequency vibration that I felt in the marrow of my bones. We land at Teterboro in 3 hours, Gideon said. He reached for a crystal carafe and poured 2 fingers of water into a heavy glass. He didn't offer me a drink. He knew I was already intoxicated by the math of the collapse. We go straight to the proxy fight. I want you to be the one to deliver the ultimatum to the board. I want to be the last thing he sees before he loses his office, I said. I turned my head to look out the window as we surged into the sky. Austin fell away, a map of sun-bleached roads and glass towers. Below us, the invisible lines of the global financial system were shifting, redirected by the commands Marcus and I had set in motion. I closed my eyes and envisioned the Sterling and Cross headquarters on 50th Street. I thought about the bullpen, on the 42nd floor where I had spent 1,000 nights bleeding for a man who didn't know my middle name. I thought about the red Audi window rolling up. A slow, predatory smile touched my lips. Sienna thought she was winning because she had the passenger seat, I whispered to the empty air. She didn't realize the car was headed for a cliff. And I'm the one who cut the brakes. The descent into the New York area was a study in gray and steel. The Manhattan skyline rose out of the mist like a jagged crown of thorns. I watched the Empire State Building and the new glass needles of Billionaires Row come into focus. This was the city that had broken me. Now, it was the city that would host my coronation. As the wheels touched the tarmac at Teterboro, my tablet pinged. A notification from the New York Stock Exchange. Trading of Sterling and Cross, ticker, STX, has been temporarily halted following a 22% plunge in pre-market activity. Gideon looked at the screen, then at me. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The blood was in the water. I stood up, my heels clicking on the cabin floor with the rhythm of a ticking bomb. I pulled on my midnight blue blazer, the structured shoulders snapping into place. Let's go, I said. I walked down the air stairs and into the waiting black SUV. The air in New Jersey was damp and smelled of jet fuel and salt, the smell of Manhattan. We surged onto the highway, the driver weaving through traffic with a cold, professional aggression that matched my own. As we crossed the George Washington Bridge, I saw the towers of the financial district. I pulled my phone from my pocket and sent a single, anonymous email to Julian Sterling's private address. No subject. No body text. Just a single attachment, a high-resolution photo of the $600 Tissot watch he had thrown in the trash 2 years ago, now sitting on the desk of a federal prosecutor. I watched the delivered notification pop up. Welcome back to New York, Elena, I whispered to my reflection in the tinted window. The architect is here. And she brought the wrecking ball. The SUV pulled up to the curb of 50th Street, directly in front of the Sterling and Cross entrance. I saw the news vans already circling like vultures. I saw the security guards looking frantic. And then, I saw Julian. He was standing just inside the glass doors, his face pale, his tie slightly crooked, staring at his phone with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. He looked up as I stepped out of the car. For a heartbeat, he didn't recognize the woman in the Saint Laurent suit. And then, the recognition hit him like a physical blow. The trap wasn't just set. It was closing. The lobby of the Sterling and Cross building was a cathedral of glass and ego, but today, the air tasted of copper and ozone, the scent of a dying circuit. I stepped through the revolving doors, the Saint Laurent heel striking the white marble with a sound like a pistol shot. Crack. 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 The noise echoed up into the vaulted ceiling, cutting through the low, frantic murmur of 100 panicked employees. Gregory, the head of security who had spent 3 years watching me sprint past his desk with a stack of midnight folders, didn't even look up. He was too busy fielding a call from the CEO's office about unauthorized press in the plaza. I walked toward the turnstiles. I didn't reach for my old, battered ID. Instead, I pulled out a sleek, black card, the absolute access key for the liquidator team from Caldwell and Forge. I held the card over the sensor. Beep. The light turned a cold, neon green. The mechanical gates swung open with a hiss of pneumatic submission. I didn't just walk through, I reclaimed the space. Going up, Elena? Marcus's voice crackled in my earpiece. He was stationed 3 blocks away in a mobile command unit, his fingers dancing across the back doors of the Sterling and Cross servers. I've just locked the executive elevator to floor 50. You're the only one who can move it. I'm in, Marcus, I said. My pulse was a steady, rhythmic thrum in my neck, perfectly flat. I stepped into the elevator. The doors closed, sealing me in a box of mirrors and polished steel. As the lift surged upward, the pressure in my ears intensified. I watched the floor numbers flicker on the LED display. 42, that was where my life had been buried. I didn't stop there. 50. The doors slid open. The executive floor was a disaster zone dressed in mahogany. Assistants were frantically stuffing documents into shredder bins. Junior partners were huddled in glass-walled offices, their faces the color of curdled milk. I ignored them all, walking straight toward the corner office, the one with the harbor view. The one Julian Sterling had used as his throne. I stopped in front of the door. The brass nameplate, Julian Sterling, senior partner, was still there. It was held in place by 2 small, silver screws. I signaled to the 2 men in black suits who followed me. One of them handed me a small, precision screwdriver. I didn't let them do it. This was my ritual. I felt the weight of the tool in my palm, the cold, knurled metal providing a grounding grip. I placed the tip into the head of the first screw. My hand was as steady as a surgeon's. I turned. The metal let out a sharp, protesting creak before it began to rotate. I felt the vibration travel up my arm, a physical manifestation of Julian's power being unthreaded. I unscrewed the second one, the brass plate falling into my gloved hand with a satisfying, heavy clink. I looked at the 2 dark, empty holes left in the drywall. They looked like 2 hollow eyes. I dropped the nameplate into a cardboard box held by my assistant and pushed open the door. The office was empty, but Julian's ghost was everywhere. The scent of his oud would lingered in the air, a stale, cloying presence. I walked to the massive desk, a slab of dark, polished cherry wood. I ran my fingers over the surface. It was cool, smooth, and smelled of lemon oil and deception. I sat in the chair. It was high-backed, leather, and far too large for a man who possessed such a small soul. I spun the chair around to look at the view. The harbor was a sheet of gray silk under the Manhattan sky. Excuse me? A voice trembled from the doorway. I spun the chair back around. Standing there was a young man, barely 24, clutching a stack of red-lined ledgers. His name was Arthur. I remembered him as the intern I had trained, the one who had stayed in the bullpen until 2 a.m. to fix Julian's errors. He looked like he hadn't slept in a month. "This office is restricted," Arthur stammered, his eyes wide as he processed my face. The board said nobody goes in here until the Chapter 11 team arrives." "I am the liquidator, Arthur," I said. My voice was a calm, lethal whisper. "Come in. Close the door." Arthur hesitated, then stepped inside, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. He stood in the center of the room, looking like a man awaiting execution. "Elena," he whispered. "But you were on the 42nd floor. You disappeared. People said you had a nervous breakdown." "I had an awakening, Arthur," I said. I gestured to the chair across from me, the one Julian used to intimidate his victims. "Sit down. We need to talk about the covenants Julian broke in the Pioneer account." For the next hour, I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I performed a clinical interrogation of Arthur's memory. I was looking for the mules, the people who had actually done the work while Julian celebrated. Arthur, as it turned out, was a genius of algorithmic forecasting. He had been doing Julian's job for a fraction of a junior analyst's salary. He told the board that a chimera architecture was his, Arthur said, his voice shaking as he realized the depth of the betrayal. But he didn't even know how to run the macro formulas. I had to do it for him every night. "Julian Sterling is no longer a factor in your universe, Arthur," I said. I closed the folder on the desk with a final, heavy thud. "As of 10 minutes ago, you are promoted to Senior Data Analyst for Caldwell and Forge, East Coast Division. Your salary has tripled. You report directly to me." Arthur stared at me, his mouth slightly open, a slow, dawning realization of survival creeping into his eyes. Are you serious?" "I don't joke during business hours, Arthur," I replied. "Now, get out there and start the server migration. If anyone from the old regime tries to stop you, tell them to come to this office." As Arthur scrambled out of the room, looking like he had just won the lottery, I felt a deep, resonant satisfaction. I wasn't just destroying the guilty, I was elevating the exploited. I was rebalancing the scales Julian had tipped for 3 years. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. I saw the red taillights of the Manhattan traffic below. I thought about the Audi window rolling up. I thought about the $600 watch. I pulled my phone out and sent a single text to Gideon Cross. "The bridgehead is established. Send the auditors. I want Julian's personal accounts frozen by the time he hits the lobby." I sat back down in the leather chair. It felt incredibly comfortable. I reached for the desk phone and pressed the line for the CEO's office. "Thomas," I said when the old man answered, his voice thick with terror. "This is Elena Vance from Caldwell and Forge. I've reviewed the hostile takeover documents. You have 20 minutes to convene the board, or I start the asset stripping procedure on your personal equity." The silence on the other end was absolute. It was the sound of an era ending. I hung up the phone and looked at the empty space on the wall where Julian's degree had hung. I realized I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt like a surgeon who had successfully removed a tumor. The patient, my life, was finally breathing again. But as I looked down at the street, I saw a familiar black Audi A8 pulling up to the curb. Julian was here. He thought he was coming to save his company. He didn't know he was coming to his own autopsy. And I was the one holding the scalpel. The hum of the office had changed. It was no longer the electric buzz of ambition, it was the low, desperate drone of a forensic audit. Teams of accountants in white shirts, their sleeves rolled up like soldiers in a trench, were picking through the digital entrails of Sterling and Cross. I sat at Julian's cherrywood desk, watching the data flow across my monitors. Each line of code, each hidden ledger, was a confession. The door buzzed. "Elena? There's a woman in the lobby. She's being quite insistent," Arthur's voice came through the intercom, sounding strained. "She says she's a personal friend. Sienna Brooks." A cold, Clinical satisfaction settled in my chest. I didn't smile. I didn't let my pulse skip. I simply straightened the lapel of my midnight blue blazer. Send her up, Arthur. And have security stand by. 5 minutes later, the door to the executive suite swung open. Sienna didn't walk in, she stumbled. The polished, airbrushed influencer who had mocked me in the red silk dress 18 months ago was gone. In her place was a woman who looked like she was held together by expensive concealer and sheer panic. Her blonde hair, once a gold halo, was flat, the dark roots showing like a stain. But it was the bag that told the real story. She was clutching a canvas tote with a faded designer logo. It was a knockoff, a desperate attempt to maintain the facade of a woman who still belonged on the Upper East Side. I watched her knuckles whiten as she gripped the straps, the cheap material fraying under the tension of her grip. "Elena," she gasped, her voice cracking. She took a step toward the desk, then stopped when I didn't stand up. I remained seated, a statue of ivory and shadow. "Elena, thank God. I've been trying to reach Julian, but his phone is disconnected. The building managers, they changed the locks on the apartment this morning." I looked at her, my gaze moving slowly from her unkempt hair down to the scuffed toes of her shoes. The apartment was leased under a Sterling and Cross corporate account, Sienna. As the lead liquidator, I terminated all non-essential expenditures at 9 a.m. Your living arrangements were classified as a toxic liability. Sienna's face drained of color, making the dark circles under her eyes pop with a sickly intensity. Toxic liability? Elena, we were friends. I was there for you when you were sick. I told you to get help. You told me I was complex while you sat in the passenger seat of an Audi Julian paid for with my R&D budget, I said. My voice was a surgical whisper, precise and cold. I picked up a thick stack of papers from the desk, the forensic audit Marcus and I had finalized an hour ago. I didn't just hand them to her. I spread them out across the cherrywood surface like a tarot reading of her ruin. "Do you recognize these, Sienna?" I asked. I pointed to a series of highlighted rows. 6-figure payments for executive wardrobe acquisition and visual branding consultation. All paid to Jenkins and Company. A shell company with 0 employees and an address that matches Julian's brownstone. Sienna began to shake, a violent, rhythmic tremor that started in her hands and moved to her jaw. "Julian told me, he said it was a bonus. He said the company owed it to him." "It's called embezzlement, Sienna," I corrected. "And because the funds were moved through electronic banking across state lines, the FBI calls it wire fraud. You didn't just take kickbacks, you helped Julian bleed this firm dry while I was working 20-hour days to keep the servers from crashing." Sienna reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the desk. "Elena, please. I have nothing. My accounts are frozen. I don't even have enough for a hotel. Can't you just give me a job? An assistant role? I'll do anything." I watched her for a long, unblinking minute. I felt the phantom weight of the years I'd spent being her confidant, the hours I'd spent listening to her complain about the stress of her influencer life while I was paying her rent. I reached under the desk and pressed the silent security button. "Sienna, do you remember the nor'easter?" I asked. She froze, her eyes darting toward the window. "What?" "November. The ice storm," I continued, my voice flat and horizontal. "I was standing in the slush, my fingers bleeding, my lungs failing. You were sitting in the Audi. You looked at me, and you laughed. You didn't just watch me freeze, you enjoyed the view." I didn't know you were that sick," she stammered, the lie dying on her lips as I pulled up the text logs on the monitor, the ones where she and Julian joked about me being a walking corpse. "You knew," I said. "And now, the math has finally balanced." The door opened. 2 burly security guards in gray uniforms stepped into the room. Sienna spun around, her cheap bag hitting the floor with a hollow thud. "Elena, no. You can't do this. I'll tell the police everything." "Betray, Julian," she screamed as the guards took her by the arms. "You'll certainly try," I said, turning my chair back toward the harbor view. "But as of 20 minutes ago, the FBI has the full digital trail. Your testimony won't be a bargain, Sienna. It will be a confession." "Get her out of my office," I added, without looking back. The sound of her sobbing echoed down the hallway, a jagged, ugly noise that was finally cut off by the heavy click of the executive suite doors. I sat in the silence. It was golden. It was clinical. It was the sound of a fiduciary duty finally being fulfilled. Arthur stepped into the room, looking pale. "That was intense, Elena." "That was an audit, Arthur," I said. I stood up and smoothed the fabric of my trousers. "Now, prepare the documents for the deposition. Julian is scheduled for 10 a.m. tomorrow. I want the room kept at 62 degrees. I want him shivering before we even ask the first question." I walked to the window. The Manhattan sky was a bruised purple, the lights of the city flickering on like a million predatory eyes. Julian Sterling thought he was a titan. He was about to find out that when you build a house of cards, the architect is the only one who knows which card to pull. As I left the building, Marcus called my private line. "Elena, the SEC just issued the formal indictment. Julian's lawyers are trying to negotiate a surrender, but Gideon told them to shove it. We're going to the full deposition." "Good," I said, stepping into the black SUV. "I don't want a surrender. I want a dissection. Make sure the court reporter is the best in the city. I want every stutter, every bead of sweat, and every lie recorded for posterity." The steno machine possessed 22 keys. They were flat, gray, and completely devoid of letters. In the dead silence of the conference room, they made a dry, rhythmic sound like a scalpel slicing through stiff parchment. Click. Clink click. Click. I sat at the head of the 40-foot mahogany table, my spine perfectly straight, my hands folded over a leather-bound dossier. The air in the room was exactly 62 degrees. It was a temperature designed to preserve computer servers, and to make guilty men shiver. Across from me sat Julian Sterling. He had arrived 30 minutes late, a pathetic, transparent attempt at a power play that had only served to make his legal counsel, a sweating man named Miller, look even more frantic. Julian wore a charcoal Zegna suit that was impeccably tailored but possessed a micro-crease at the elbow that spoke of a man who had slept in his clothes. The arrogant charm that had once been his primary asset was gone, replaced by a gray, doughy pallor and a faint twitch in his right eyelid. Gideon Cross sat to my left, his gray eyes fixed on Julian with the clinical boredom of an apex predator watching a wounded stag. "Let the record show that the witness, Julian Sterling, has been sworn in," Gideon said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to absorb the ambient light of the room. "Mr. Sterling, you understand you are under oath, and that any false statement constitutes perjury under federal law?" Julian adjusted his silk tie, the movement jerky. "I understand," he said. His voice was thin, devoid of the baritone confidence that had once held boardrooms captive. "Excellent," Gideon said, leaning back. "Let's discuss the Chimera project. You filed a claim stating that my client, Elena Vance, committed intellectual property theft. You claim she stole the proprietary code and delivered it to Caldwell and Forge." Julian looked at me. A flicker of the old fire returned to his eyes, a toxic mix of possessiveness and hatred. "She did," Julian said, leaning forward. "Elena had total access to my files. She was a junior analyst who became obsessed with the project. When we didn't align on certain personal matters, she took the algorithms to sabotage the firm's market capitalization and feed data to her new employers." I didn't blink. I didn't correct him. A clinical detachment settled in my chest, heavy and freezing. I watched the court reporter's fingers fly over the steno keys. Click. Click. Julian was digging his own grave. I had simply provided the shovel. "Mr. Sterling," Gideon said softly. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick, red-lined folder. This was the moment of the autopsy. He didn't hand it to Julian. He dropped it in the center of the table with a heavy, resonant thud that caused Julian to flinch. Could you explain why you approved these six-figure disbursements over the last 24 months? Miller, Julian's attorney, grabbed the folder with a hand that shook slightly. He opened it, his eyes scanning the columns of numbers, the bank wire receipts, and the corporate filings for Jenkins and Company. I watched Julian. A bead of moisture, thick and oily, detached from his hairline and began a slow, gravitational crawl down his temple. It traced a jagged path through his foundation makeup, exposing the pale, terrified skin beneath. It hung for a heartbeat at his jawline before falling onto the polished mahogany table, forming a perfect, miniature dome of salt and stress. The steno machine clicked once. Then silence. This is outside the scope of an IP claim, Miller stammered, his face turning the color of raw ham. This is highly irregular. We are establishing a pattern of financial misconduct, Gideon replied, his voice deadly calm. My client didn't need to sabotage the Chimera project, Mr. Sterling. You were already bleeding it dry to fund Sienna Brooks's lifestyle. You committed embezzlement of corporate assets, which constitutes a breach of your fiduciary duty to the board. Julian stared at the red-line documents. The facade didn't just crack, it disintegrated. His breathing became shallow, his chest rattling in the cold room. This is fabricated, Julian whispered, looking at me. His eyes were wide now, the pupils dilated with pure, unadulterated terror. Elena, you made this up. You're trying to destroy me. I leaned forward, my forearms resting on the cool edge of the table. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke in the same surgical whisper I used to debug a failing algorithm. I didn't make up the wire transfers to the Cayman Islands, Julian, I said. I didn't make up the false invoices for Sienna's wardrobe. I simply found the trail you were too arrogant to cover. I gave you 2 years of my life. I gave you the code that made you a millionaire. And you left me to die in a blizzard. Julian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping on a dry deck. Miller leaned in and whispered fiercely into Julian's ear. Julian didn't seem to hear him. His eyes were locked on mine, searching for a trace of the woman who would have done anything to protect him. He found nothing but the reflection of his own ruin. I suggest we take a 10-minute recess, Miller said, his voice cracking as he physically grabbed Julian's arm to pull him out of the room. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind them. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the hum of the HVAC system. Gideon looked at me, a slow, predatory smile touching his lips. He reached over the table and tapped the red dossier. You did it, Elena, Gideon said. He's done. He'll withdraw the claim by sunset. He doesn't have a choice, I replied. I looked at the court reporter, who was stretching her fingers. Did you get all of that? Every word, Ms. Vance, she said, nodding. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. The city below was a blur of gray and yellow, but the air in the room felt lighter than it had in years. The weight on my chest, the phantom cold of that November night, was finally gone. Julian Sterling thought he could use me as a footstool to reach the stars. He forgot that an architect knows exactly how much weight a structure can bear before it collapses. 10 minutes later, Miller returned to the room alone. He was pale, his eyes fixed on the floor. My client is withdrawing his claim with prejudice, Miller said, his voice hollow. He is willing to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Please, do not forward these documents to the authorities. I looked at Gideon, then back at Miller. As a managing partner of Caldwell and Forge, I have a fiduciary duty to report asset misappropriation, I said, my voice ice-cold. The files were electronically transmitted to the FBI's white-collar crime division 20 minutes ago. Good day, Mr. Miller. The silence in the aftermath of the deposition was not empty, it was pressurized. I walked out of the conference room, my Saint Laurent heels clicking against the marble floor with a rhythmic finality. Behind me, Julian was a ghost of a man, his expensive suit now looking like a shroud. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. In my world, once the math was settled, the human variable was irrelevant. Elena. Gideon Cross caught up to me at the elevators. He didn't look triumphant, he looked satisfied, like a man who had just watched a complex machine perform exactly as he had engineered it. He held his phone out. The screen was a chaotic mosaic of red and white, the Bloomberg terminal. The SEC has just frozen all personal and corporate assets tied to Julian Sterling and Cross, Gideon said, his voice a low, melodic rumble. The indictment is being unsealed as we speak. They aren't just going for wire fraud. They're looking at RICO, racketeering. They're claiming the entire Chimera project was a vehicle for institutional money laundering. I watched the floor numbers on the elevator display descend. 10, 8. 6. Julian thought he was the architect, I said, my pulse remaining perfectly flat. He didn't realize that in a house built on lies, the only thing holding up the roof is the silence of the people who know the truth. And I'm done being silent. The elevator chimed, a bright, cheerful sound that felt like a mockery of the carnage upstairs. The doors slid open to the lobby. It was no longer a temple of finance. It was a crime scene. 4 men in navy windbreakers with "Federal Agent" emblazoned in stark, yellow letters across their backs stood near the security desk. They didn't look like the polished quants I worked with. They looked like the tactical end of a long-delayed justice. Their presence was a cold, physical weight in the room, smelling of rain and unyielding bureaucracy. I saw Julian then. He had taken the stairs or a service lift, a desperate attempt to bypass the inevitable. He was trying to push through the revolving doors, his face a distorted mask of sweat and panic. Miller, his attorney, was trying to hold him back, his hands fluttering like trapped birds. Julian Sterling? One of the agents stepped forward. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed the absolute authority of the United States government. Julian stopped. He looked at the agent, then his eyes darted to me, standing in the center of the lobby like a midnight blue shadow. Elena, please, he croaked. He reached out a hand, his fingers trembling, a final, pathetic reflex of a man who still believed he could charm his way out of a grave. You can fix this. You know the code. You can tell them it was an error. A technical glitch. I walked toward him. I didn't stop until I was 3 feet away, the exact distance he had kept from me while I was shivering in the snow 18 months ago. I didn't answer him. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out a small, heavy object. I placed it on the marble security desk between us. It was the $600 Tissot watch. The crystal was cracked, the leather strap frayed where it had hit the bottom of the trash bin. It's 4 p.m., Julian, I said, my voice a surgical whisper. The markets are closed. And so are you. The agent didn't wait for Julian to respond. He reached for the heavy, stainless steel handcuffs at his belt. I watched the process with a clinical, slow-motion detachment. The agent gripped Julian's right wrist. I heard the first click, a sharp, ratcheting sound that seemed to echo in the vaulted lobby. It was the sound of a fiduciary duty being balanced by a criminal consequence. Then the second click. Julian's hands were pulled behind his back. The arrogance that had defined his life vanished, leaving behind something small, hollow, and utterly broken. His knees buckled, his charcoal Zegna trousers hitting the white marble with a muffled thud. Julian Sterling, you are under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, and grand larceny, the agent recited, the words a rhythmic, heartless litany. I looked at the lobby's massive TV screens. The CNBC ticker was a sea of crimson. The Sterling and Cross logo was being replaced by a generic, trading halted, graphic. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the side entrance. Sienna Brooks was being led out by 2 other agents. She was screaming, a jagged, ugly sound that cut through the sterile air. She wasn't wearing the mink coat today. She was wearing a cheap tracksuit, her face blotchy and devoid of the filters that had sustained her facade. Julian. You promised, she shrieked, her voice echoing off the glass walls. You said we were safe. You said she was nothing. Julian didn't look at her. He didn't look at anything. He stared at the floor, his eyes fixed on the empty space where his nameplate used to be. Gideon Cross stepped up beside me, his hand resting lightly on the small of my back. His touch was grounding, a warm contrast to the sub-zero satisfaction settling in my marrow. The asset freezing order has hit his offshore accounts, Gideon noted, checking his watch, a Patek Philippe that cost more than Julian's entire car collection. He doesn't have enough liquid cash left to buy a sandwich, let alone a defense team. He has the truth now, I said. It's the only thing he's ever owned that he didn't have to steal. The agents began to lead Julian away. As he passed me, he looked up one last time. For a heartbeat, the man who had left me in a blizzard saw the woman he had created. I didn't offer him a smile. I didn't offer him a tear. I simply watched him go. The revolving doors turned, a slow, mechanical grind that pushed him out into the rain and the waiting cameras of the New York press. The flashes of 100 photographers erupted like silent, white explosions against the gray Manhattan sky. I turned back to Gideon. It's done, I said. Not quite, Gideon replied, his gray eyes sharpening. The board of Caldwell and Forge just voted. They want to officially name you as the managing partner for the East Coast integration. You aren't just the architect anymore, Elena. You're the owner. I looked at the white marble lobby, now empty of Julian's ghost. The clinical coldness in my chest began to thaw, replaced by a low-frequency hum of power. Let's go home, Gideon, I said. I have a lot of blueprints to redraw. As I stepped into the black SUV, my phone buzzed. A news alert, Sterling and Cross files for Chapter 7 liquidation. CEO Julian Sterling faces 25 years in federal prison. I deleted the app. I didn't need the alerts anymore. I looked at Marcus, who was sitting in the driver's seat, a slow, triumphant smile on his face. Austin, he asked. Austin, I replied. But first, pull over at Charles Street. I want to leave something behind. I stepped out into the light drizzle and walked to the corner where I had collapsed 18 months ago. I took the Tissot watch from my pocket and placed it on the icy curb. I didn't look back. I was no longer the girl who bled for a ghost. I was the woman who had burned the ghost to the ground. Manhattan in late spring was a different beast than the whiteout nightmare that had nearly claimed my life. The air didn't bite, it hummed with the electric vitality of a city that had already forgotten the name Julian Sterling. I stood on the private terrace of my new penthouse on the 68th floor of the Park Tower. The sun was a bruised, heavy gold, sinking behind the Hudson River and painting the skyline in shades of amber and violent violet. Below me, the city looked like a circuit board, millions of flickering lights, millions of transactions, and for the first time, I wasn't just a component in the machine. I was the one controlling the current. The glass door behind me slid open with a whisper of precision-engineered silicon. The final equity distribution was just authorized by the board, Gideon Cross said. His voice was a low-frequency rumble that seemed to vibrate in the glass railing beneath my hands. He stepped onto the terrace, the scent of expensive cedar and high-end filtration systems following him. Sterling and Cross's remains have been fully integrated. The Chimera algorithm is now the cornerstone of our East Coast Fund. Your personal capital gains for the quarter just cleared 8 figures. I didn't turn around. I watched the first lights of the financial district blink on. It's funny, I said, my voice as level as the horizon. When I was with Julian, I used to think of fiduciary duty as a burden, something I had to protect him from. I didn't realize it's actually a shield. It's the rule that says the math doesn't care about your feelings. The math is the only thing that's honest, Elena, Gideon said. He walked up beside me, standing close enough that I could feel the radiant heat from his charcoal wool blazer. He wasn't looking at the city. He was looking at me. You aren't the girl who fled to Austin anymore, he noted. No, I replied, finally turning to face him. My pulse remained perfectly flat, but there was a new, resonant strength behind it. That girl died in the snow on Charles Street. I'm the one who inherited her blueprints. Gideon reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound folder. It was the official partnership agreement for Caldwell and Forge. This wasn't a temporary contract, this was the document that named me managing partner. "Sign it," he said. "And let's finish this." I took the folder. We walked back inside to the minimalist dining table, a single, massive slab of white Carrara marble that felt as cold and ancient as a glacier. I reached for the pen sitting in the center of the table. It was a custom-made fountain pen, weighted at exactly 48 grams, the barrel crafted from matte black titanium. I felt the cool, textured grip against my thumb and forefinger, a grounding weight that signaled the end of my long, clinical journey. I opened the folder. The paper was heavy, cream-colored vellum that smelled faintly of vanilla and old money. I didn't rush. This was the moment of the final stitch. I positioned the gold nib over the signature line. I watched the light catch the polished metal, a tiny, brilliant spark in the darkening room. My hand was a study in absolute stillness. I pressed down. I felt the microscopic resistance of the paper as the nib bit into the grain. The ink, a deep, midnight blue that matched my suit, began to flow. It was a slow, controlled bleed, the fluid spreading into the fibers of the vellum with a soft, scratching sound like a secret being whispered. I moved the pen in a fluid, surgical arc, forming the E in a sharp, uncompromising stroke. Each letter of my name felt like a physical foundation stone being laid. Elena Van C. I watched the ink bloom, the wet sheen reflecting the Manhattan lights outside before it settled into a permanent, indelible stain. The loop of the E was the final closure. The pen lifted. The sound of it clicking back into its cap was the only noise in the room, a sharp, final snap that echoed off the marble walls. "It's done," I said. I pushed the folder toward Gideon. He didn't look at the signature. He looked at the way my hand didn't shake as I released it. "Welcome to the firm, Elena," he said. "The private jet is fueled and ready. Marcus is already on board. We're heading back to Austin for the weekend. I think you've earned a break from this city." "I don't need a break, Gideon," I said, a slow, predatory smile finally touching my lips. "I need a new project. I've been looking at the diversified portfolio of a certain private equity firm in Chicago that Julian used to admire. They have some structural weaknesses I'd like to exploit." Gideon let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound of genuine appreciation. "You're a monster, Elena. I knew there was a reason I liked you." "I'm an architect, Gideon," I corrected. "And I've learned that the best way to build something that lasts is to ensure you're the one holding the demolition codes." We flew back to Austin under a canopy of stars. I sat in the cream leather seat of the Gulfstream, my tablet on my lap. I wasn't looking at the markets. I was looking at a photo Marcus had sent me. It was a shot of the federal courthouse in Manhattan. Julian Sterling was being led down the steps in a beige jumpsuit, his hands cuffed, his head bowed. He looked small. He looked like an error code in a system that had already self-corrected. I deleted the photo. I didn't need it for my records. I looked out the window as the lights of Austin began to appear, a sprawling, glowing grid of opportunity. I thought about the studio apartment over the bakery. I thought about the days I had spent working in the dark, fueled by nothing but the cold logic of revenge. The revenge was over. The ROI had been 100%. But the ambition? That was just beginning. I reached for my glass of ice water and took a sip. It was crisp, clean, and perfectly cold. Marcus looked at me from the seat across the aisle, his eyes bright with a pride he didn't need to put into words. "You okay, Elle?" he asked. "I'm better than okay, Marcus," I said. "I'm the managing partner." I leaned my head back and closed my eyes. For the first time in 3 years, the silence in my head wasn't a void. It was a blueprint. And as the plane descended toward the Texas soil, I began to draw. As the wheels touched the tarmac, my personal phone pings with a new, encrypted message. "It's from an anonymous source in the SEC, Vance. Thought you'd like to know. Julian Sterling just tried to trade his remaining offshore secrets for a reduced sentence." The prosecutor laughed and told him he had nothing left to sell. You stripped him to the bone. I didn't smile. I didn't reply. I simply turned off the screen and stepped out into the warm Austin night. Julian Sterling was the past. I was the future. And in my world, the only thing that survives is the math.